I thought I was just getting the chain shortened. I thought it was a simple errand. 20 minutes, maybe 30. Drop the necklace off at the jeweler on 5th, pick up some groceries on the way back, and be home before Daniel finished his conference call. I had no idea that a quiet Tuesday afternoon in October would rip apart everything I had spent 3 years carefully, lovingly, stubbornly building. I had no idea that the errand I almost skipped, the one I nearly postponed for the 4th time that month, would be the only thing that stood between me and losing everything I owned. Because when Marcus, the jeweler who had worked that corner shop for over 30 years, held the pendant under his loupe and went very, very still, and then looked up at me with an expression I cannot describe as anything other than dread, and said, quietly, almost gently, the way a doctor delivers a terminal diagnosis, "Clara, take it off right now." I understood somewhere in the marrow of my bones that the beautiful silver pendant Daniel had clasped around my neck on our 3rd anniversary was not the gift I thought it was. It had never been a gift at all. The pendant arrived on a Sunday morning in late July, wrapped in a small black velvet pouch that Daniel placed beside my coffee cup while I was still half asleep, still wearing his old university sweatshirt, still warm and unhurried, and blissfully unaware. I remember the way the light moved through the kitchen window that morning, long golden bars of it cutting across the white tile floor, and the smell of dark roast coffee and buttered toast, and the sound of the birds in the oak tree outside, the one that had stood in the garden of this house for longer than either of us had been alive. I remember all of it with a sharpness that hurts now, the way all beautiful things hurt once you know what was hidden beneath them. Daniel sat across from me, watching my face with an expression of careful, attentive delight as I loosened the drawstring and tipped the pendant into my palm. It was heavier than I expected. Solid sterling silver, oval-shaped, about the size of a large coin, with a delicate pattern of engraved ivy leaves winding around its perimeter. In the center, a small moonstone caught the light, a pale, milky glimmer that shifted from blue to cream depending on how I moved. It was, objectively, one of the most beautiful things I had ever held. I turned it over. The back was smooth and warm from the velvet, completely plain except for a tiny engraved inscription, C and D, always. "It's a locket," Daniel said, leaning forward across the table. His voice was careful in that particular way of his. Not nervous exactly, but measured, like a man aware he was walking near the edge of something. "There's a compartment inside. Small one. I left it empty so you could put whatever you wanted in it. A photo, maybe. A piece of paper. Whatever means something to you." I looked up at him. He was smiling, and it was a good smile. The one that still, even then, made something in my chest loosen. I put the pendant down on the table, stood up, and kissed him. He tasted like coffee and the familiar warmth of early morning, and I actually thought, this is it. This is what a good life looks like. I wore the pendant every single day for the next 3 months. I wore it to work, where I managed a team of 12 people at a mid-sized architecture firm and spent my days buried in contracts and site reports and the particular low-grade stress of deadline season. I wore it to dinner with my father, who noticed it immediately and said it suited me. I wore it to Sunday lunches at Eleanor's house, where I always sat in the chair with the uneven leg and ate food that was perfectly prepared and entirely devoid of warmth, and smiled until my face ached. I wore it everywhere. It became part of how I understood myself, a small, solid weight against my sternum, a reminder that I was loved. This house, our house, the one I had inherited from my grandmother 3 years before I ever met Daniel, was everything to me in a way that was almost embarrassing to admit out loud. It was a narrow, three-story Victorian on a tree-lined street in one of the city's older neighborhoods, with tall sash windows, an original cornicing, and a kitchen that was perpetually in need of some minor repair, and I loved every drafty, impractical inch of it. My grandmother, Edith, had lived there for 41 years. She had raised my mother there, and my mother had raised me on weekends and summers there. And when Edith died and left it to me, not to my mother, not to any distant cousin, but to me specifically. Because, she said in the letter the solicitor read aloud, Clara is the one who understands what a house is for. I felt the weight of that trust, like something physical, a responsibility, a privilege. When Daniel and I married and moved in together, it was never a question that we would live there. It was my house. Always had been. Always would be. The mortgage was fully paid. The house was in my name alone. That was something I had been precise about, not out of distrust, not then, but out of the quiet pragmatism my grandmother had tried her whole life to instill in me. Keep what is yours clearly in your name, Clara. Not because the people around you are untrustworthy, but because the world is, and paperwork is the only language it speaks. I had listened. I had been careful. I had thought I was safe. I had not counted on Eleanor. Eleanor Marsh was 63 years old, sharp-featured, impeccably dressed, and in possession of a smile that she deployed with the precision of a surgical instrument. She was one of those women who managed to make generosity feel like debt, the kind of person who gives a gift with one hand while the other is already writing the invoice. She brought wine to dinner parties and held the bottle just long enough for you to notice the label. She offered to help with the wedding flowers and then referenced the favor for years afterward, in small, almost imperceptible ways, the way a river erodes stone. Not dramatically, but constantly, and always in the same direction. She had not been delighted when Daniel told her he was marrying me. She had been polite about it, which was somehow worse. She had taken me to lunch, just the two of us, at a restaurant she chose, at a table she had clearly reserved in advance, and spent an hour asking me questions that were not quite questions. And the house, it's quite large for one person, isn't it? You must rattle around in it. Your grandmother left it entirely to you, not to your mother as well? That must have been a complicated conversation. Daniel says you're not planning to list it on the market. That's interesting. Properties in that area have really appreciated. Each sentence landed lightly, like a bird touching down on a wire, and each one left in me the same faint, uncomfortable flutter of a thing I could not name. But I was in love, and I was happy, and I had spent enough years in the world to know that a difficult mother-in-law was not unusual, and that the answer to her was patience and distance in equal measure. So I kept my distance, I kept my patience, and I told myself the discomfort I felt around Eleanor was my own problem. A failure of generosity, a misreading of a woman who was simply in her own way trying to hold on to her son. I told myself that for 3 years. I was spectacularly wrong. The first thing I noticed, about a month before the pendant entered our lives, was that Daniel had started taking phone calls in the garden. This was not, in itself, remarkable. He worked in commercial real estate, and his days were threaded through with calls that spilled over into evenings and weekends. What was remarkable was the way he did it, stepping through the back door with a particular speed, pulling it shut behind him, his voice dropping as soon as the latch clicked. I noticed it once and thought nothing of it. I noticed it a second time and told myself it was a difficult client. I noticed it a third time and stood in the kitchen with my hands around a mug of tea that had gone cold, listening to the silence on the other side of the door, and felt the first whisper of something I was not ready to call suspicion. Around that same time, Eleanor started asking questions about the house with a frequency that crossed the line from curious into something else entirely. She asked about the foundation survey we'd had done in the spring, who had conducted it, what the findings were, whether we'd kept the report. She asked whether we'd updated the property insurance recently. She asked, with her head tilted and her voice wrapped in the softest possible concern, whether I had ever thought about drawing up a cohabitation agreement now that Daniel and I were married. Just to protect both of you, darling. These things are so much cleaner when they're formalized. I said something pleasant and vague and changed the subject. Later, in the car on the way home, I mentioned it to Daniel, and he shrugged without looking away from the road and said his mother was old-fashioned. She just worried. It meant nothing. His voice was entirely level. Too level, maybe, in the way that flat water sometimes means nothing and sometimes means the river has run underground. But I let it go. I was busy at work. We were in the middle of a major project, and I was pulling long days and coming home depleted. And there was a part of me that found it easier to let the small discomforts accumulate at the edges of my awareness than to look directly at them. That is the thing about trust, the thing nobody tells you. It is not passive. It is a choice you make, actively again and again, to not look too hard at the things that make you uneasy. And for a long time, I had made that choice for Daniel, without even realizing I was making it. In September, 2 weeks after our anniversary, I noticed that the filing cabinet in Daniel's home office, the one where he kept the physical copies of important documents, mortgage papers, tax returns, the original deeds to the house, had been opened. I noticed because I had placed a small specific object on top of it months before, a ceramic owl, a gift from my grandmother's estate, which I had kept as a kind of talisman, and it had been moved, slightly. The owl was now facing a different direction. It was the sort of thing that most people would not notice. I was not most people. My grandmother had taught me to notice. I opened the cabinet. Everything appeared to be in order. The files were where they should be. The deeds were there. I found them in the green folder where I always kept them, behind the tax returns and in front of the insurance documents. I pulled them out, flipped through them, and found nothing out of place. The signature on the deed was mine. The property description was correct. The house was mine. I put everything back. I replaced the owl in its original position, facing the door, and I stood in the middle of Daniel's quiet office in the late afternoon light, listening to the tick of the clock on the wall and the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere on the street, and I told myself I was being paranoid. 3 weeks later, I went to the jeweler. Marcus Edelman had been a fixture of that part of the city for as long as I could remember. His shop occupied a narrow storefront between a dry cleaner and a Vietnamese restaurant, its window crowded with a rotating display of watches and estate jewelry behind thick glass. I had been going there since I was a teenager, first with my grandmother, who had bought most of her jewelry repaired there over the decades, and then on my own. Marcus knew me by name. He had appraised the small collection of pieces Edith had left me after she died. He was the only jeweler I trusted. That Tuesday, I pushed open the door and heard the familiar chime of the small bell overhead and breathed in the particular smell of the shop, metal and polish, and the faint, dusty sweetness of old velvet display cases, and felt, as I always did there, a small easing of tension. Marcus was behind the counter, bent over something under a bright work lamp, his loupe pushed up onto his forehead. He looked up when I came in, and his face arranged itself into the warm, slightly distracted expression of a man pulled out of deep concentration by something he was not entirely unhappy to be interrupted by. "Clara," he said, "been a while. What have you got for me today?" I lifted the pendant from around my neck, the chain snagging briefly in my hair, the weight of it familiar and warm in my hand, and placed it on the counter in front of him. I told him I needed the chain, shortened by about 2 inches. It sat a little low, and I kept catching it on things. He nodded, picked it up, turned it over in his fingers in that assessing, professional way of his, and reached for his loupe. I pulled out my phone and started going through my work emails. I was half absorbed in a message from a contractor about a delayed delivery when I became aware, with a slow, creeping certainty, that the shop had gone very quiet. Not the normal quiet of a jeweler at work, but a different quality of silence. The kind that has intention in it, the kind where someone is not making noise on purpose. I looked up. Marcus was standing very still, the pendant in one hand and a small, flat-headed tool in the other. The tool was resting against the back surface of the pendant at an angle I did not entirely understand. His loop was down over his eye, and he was looking at the pendant with an expression that made my stomach drop. "Marcus?" I said. "Is something wrong?" He did not answer immediately. He turned the pendant slightly under the light. Then he set the tool down, very carefully, and looked at me over the loop, and what I saw in his face, in the stillness of it, in the slight compression of his mouth, in the way his eyes had gone from professionally assessing to something much more personal, made my hands go cold. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "My husband gave it to me," I said, "for our anniversary, 3 months ago. Why? What's wrong with it?" He was quiet for another long moment, long enough that I put my phone down and turned fully toward him, no longer pretending to be distracted, every cell of my attention narrowing to the small space between us and the pendant resting in his palm. "This is a double-wall locket," Marcus said finally, his voice measured and deliberate in a way that told me he was choosing every word with care. "You can see the compartment here." He indicated the seam at the pendant's edge. "That's the one your husband would have shown you. Standard hidden compartment. Twist mechanism. But there's a secondary chamber." He paused. "Behind the false back. It's a more specialized piece of work. Whoever made this knew what they were doing." I stared at him. "A secondary chamber," I repeated. "I noticed the weight distribution was off," he said. "Too heavy for the size. Usually means there's something inside that hasn't been accounted for." He looked at me steadily. "Do you want me to open it?" The temperature of the shop seemed to drop. I was aware of a sound. It might have been the ventilation system or traffic outside or my own blood in my ears. A low, persistent hum that filled the space between Marcus's question and my answer. I thought about Daniel's hand at the back of my neck as he clasped the chain. I thought about his eyes, warm and direct, as he slid it toward me across the breakfast table. I left it empty so you could put whatever you wanted in it. "Open it," I said. Marcus set the pendant on a small, clean square of white velvet on his work surface. He picked up a thin, beveled tool and applied careful pressure to a point at the lower edge of the pendant's back plate. A point that looked, to the untrained eye, like nothing more than a decorative flourish in the engraved pattern. Something gave. The back plate separated along an almost invisible seam, hinging open with the faint, precise resistance of a very well-made thing. Marcus reached in with a pair of fine tweezers and extracted something. He set it on the white velvet beside the open pendant. It was a small roll of paper, tightly wound, no bigger than the tip of a finger, held in shape by a thin rubber band that had left a faint groove in the paper. The kind of roll you could tuck into any cavity and forget about. The kind of roll that was meant to be retrieved by someone who knew it was there. Marcus looked at me. I looked at the roll of paper. Neither of us spoke. My hands were very cold. That is the first thing I remember. The cold that started in my fingertips and moved up through my wrists and into the joints of my elbows, as though the warmth was draining out of me from the inside. My heart was doing something peculiar, a kind of stuttering, overcorrecting rhythm that I could feel in my throat and behind my eyes. The shop's white light seemed to flatten everything, making Marcus's face and the velvet and the tiny roll of paper look slightly unreal, like objects in a photograph taken under the wrong exposure. I picked up the paper roll. My fingers were trembling. Not violently, not in a way that would have been visible from across the room, but a fine, insistent tremble that I could not stop. I slid off the rubber band. I unrolled the paper. It was a photocopy. Printed in miniature, the font so small I had to hold it up to Marcus's work lamp to read it. 2 columns of dense legal text, formatted in a way I recognized immediately. I had seen dozens of documents like this in the course of managing property for clients at work, and the format was unmistakable. It was the first page of a quitclaim deed, a transfer of property. The property described in the document was my house, and the signature at the bottom of the page, neat, precise, slightly compressed at the end, was mine. I had never signed this document. I had never seen this document. I had never agreed to anything that this document claimed. The world did not spin. That is a lie people tell in stories, that the world spins when you receive catastrophic news. What actually happened was quieter and more terrible. The world went very still. The shop's hum stopped. The light held. Everything paused, as if the universe was giving me a single suspended second to understand what I was looking at before it let the reality of it fall. The property was being transferred to Eleanor Marsh. Effective date, 3 months from the previous July. 3 months from the morning Daniel clasped this pendant around my neck. 1 month from now. I set the paper down on the white velvet. I looked at Marcus, who was looking at me with the face of a man who has understood something before the person in front of him has finished understanding it herself, and is now waiting with the kind of quiet, helpless compassion of someone who cannot undo what has been done. "Take it off," he had said. He had been right to say it, because I had been wearing this thing against my skin for 3 months. This beautiful, terrible object, this gift that was never a gift, and I had not known. I had pressed it against my sternum every morning and worn it through every ordinary hour of every ordinary day, and all that time it had been carrying a secret, a countdown, a blueprint for my destruction, coiled inside like a note inside a bottle, waiting for someone with the right eyes to find it. I put the pendant in my bag. I put the photocopy in my bag. My hands had stopped trembling and gone to something worse, a kind of total, eerie steadiness, the steadiness of a person who has moved through shock and out the other side into something colder and more dangerous. "Clara," Marcus said, Is there someone you need to call?" I looked at him. I thought of Daniel. I thought of Eleanor. I thought of my house. Its oak tree, its drafty windows, its cornicing, the smell of old wood and lemon polish, and all the decades of my family that lived in its walls. I thought of my grandmother's voice. "Keep what is yours clearly in your name, Clara." "Yes," I said. "There is." I did not call Daniel. That was the first decision I made, standing in the pale fluorescent light of Marcus's shop with the photocopy of a forged quitclaim deed folded into my bag and my hands pressing flat against the glass counter, as if the counter were the only solid thing left in the world. I ran through it methodically, the way I ran through site reports at work when the numbers did not add up. What did I know? What did I not know? What could I afford to reveal and to whom? What I knew was that someone had forged my signature on a property transfer document. What I knew was that the forgery had been rolled into a miniature copy and hidden inside a pendant that my husband had given me, had clasped to my body, had sent me out into the world wearing. What I did not know yet was whether Daniel had known what was inside it, or whether Eleanor had used him as an unwitting courier, and this was the thought I had to force myself to hold still and look at directly, whether he had helped her put it there. Until I knew the answer to that question, I could not afford to tip my hand. Marcus watched me from behind the counter, and I could see in his face that he understood what I was doing. He had been in that shop for 30 years. He had learned when to speak and when to be quiet, and he was being quiet now, and I was grateful for it in a way I did not have words for. "Is there a notary office nearby?" I asked. 2 blocks east, he said. Same side of the street. I placed the pendant back on the white velvet square. "Can you hold this for me? I'll come back for it." He looked at the pendant, then at me. "I'll put it in the safe," he said. I walked out into the October afternoon. The air was cold and smelled of fallen leaves and distant rain, and I stood on the pavement and let it land. The full physical weight of what I was facing. My house. My grandmother's house. The house where I had learned to walk, where I had spent every summer of my childhood, where I had sat by Edith's bed in the last weeks of her life and held her hand. Someone had tried to take it from me. Someone had forged my name on a legal document and hidden the evidence against my skin. And in 28 days, if I had read the effective date correctly, that document would complete its journey through whatever chain of deception had been assembled for it, and my house would belong to Eleanor Marsh. I started walking east. My father answered on the second ring, the way he always did, and when I said, "Dad, I need you to meet me somewhere. Now. Don't ask questions until you get there," he said. "Text me the address." And that was the end of the conversation. That is the thing about my father that I have relied on my entire life. He does not panic. He does not lecture. He does not fill silence with empty reassurance. He arrives, he listens, he acts. He was at the notary office within 40 minutes. I had already had the photocopy examined and formally documented, the notary's notation confirming the date and content of what had been brought to her. I had already made 3 copies of everything and sealed one set in an envelope addressed to myself, which I posted from the pharmacy below. My father sat down across from me and looked at my face, and then at the photocopy I placed in front of him, and something in his expression went very quiet in a way that was nothing like calm. "Eleanor," he said. It was not a question. "I don't know how much Daniel knew," I said. "That's what I need to find out." He folded his hands on the table. "I know a man, property law, very good, very discreet. Call him tonight. Before you go home, before you speak to Daniel, before you say a single word to Eleanor." He paused. "Get the deed from the filing cabinet tonight, quietly." I looked at my father. His steady hands, his careful eyes, the small, precise set of his jaw that I had inherited, and felt the first solid handhold after a fall, the certain sensation of a surface that would hold my weight. "There's something else," I said. I told him about the filing cabinet, the displaced owl, the moment weeks ago when I had checked the deeds and found them in order. "I think they may have already replaced the original with a forgery, a good one. Good enough that I didn't notice." My father was quiet, then, "We'll find out tomorrow." I drove home through amber October dusk, and I was very, very calm. The pendant was not around my neck. My bag contained a folded photocopy, a notary's confirmation, and distributed copies in 2 separate locations. My phone contained my father's solicitor's number and a text that read simply, "He's expecting your call at 8. I parked in front of the house and sat in the car for a moment. I looked at the oak tree, bare now, its branches dark against the evening sky. I looked at the tall sash windows lit from inside. Daniel was home. I looked at the narrow terrace, the Victorian ironwork of the railing, the particular dark red of the bricks at dusk, and felt the love for it rise up in me, not sentimental, not pretty, but animal and absolute. The love of a creature for the territory it belongs to. Nobody is taking this, I thought. Upstairs, I went directly to the study. The ceramic owl sat where I had left it, facing the door. I opened the filing cabinet, took out the deed under Daniel's work lamp, and held it at an angle. The signature. My signature, almost. The slightly different pen pressure. The letter C in Clara, which curved with a millisecond's hesitation that my actual handwriting, trained by my grandmother's hand guiding mine when I was 5 years old, never had. I had not seen it before because I had not been looking. I was looking now. This was not my signature. The real deed was gone. This was a replacement already in position, waiting, which meant the plan had been further along than I had understood. The pendant's document was not a draft. It was a backup copy of an already executed fraud, planted in case anyone needed to prove she had my consent. I replaced everything exactly as I had found it. I repositioned the owl facing the door. I washed my face, looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, pale, composed, eyes very bright, and went downstairs to eat dinner with my husband and talk about nothing, and I did it so convincingly that it frightened me. The call with Paul Adler, my father's solicitor, lasted 40 minutes. He confirmed what I had already suspected. A forged quitclaim deed, if filed with the county recorder's office, would create a legal cloud on title, a confusion about ownership that could take months to resolve, during which time I could be effectively locked out of my own asset. The forged deed was legally void. A forged signature cannot create valid title. But that did not mean Eleanor could not cause serious damage before the courts caught up with the fraud. His advice: file a title protection alert with the county recorder's office first thing in the morning, change the locks, and consult a criminal attorney about forgery charges. And, this last part he said carefully without editorializing, make certain that no one currently residing at the property has access to any additional documentation relating to the deed. He meant Daniel. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark after Daniel fell asleep, his breathing slow and even beside me, the breathing of a man with no secrets or a man whose secrets had stopped keeping him awake, and made my decisions one by one, like setting down breakable things. Tomorrow morning, solicitor's office, title alert, new locks. Tomorrow evening, confrontation. Not before everything was in place. Eleanor called at 9 the next morning, while I sat in Paul's office watching him file the title alert. I let it ring twice, then answered on the third attempt because Paul had nodded. Go ahead, we're ready. Clara, darling. Her voice was warm, layered, soft and designed to make you feel wrapped in. I was hoping we could have lunch today, just the two of us. There's something I'd like to discuss. That sounds lovely, Eleanor, I said. What time? 1 o'clock? The Italian place on Henderson. Perfect, I said. I'll see you there. I hung up. Paul looked at me across his desk. She's moving the timeline up, he said, which means Daniel told her something. I know, I said. Good. Worried people make mistakes. Eleanor was already seated when I arrived. Of course she was, always first. Always the one who chose the table, arranged the terrain. She wore a deep burgundy blouse and pearl earrings, and she smiled at me with that smile that had fooled me for 3 years. I sat down, ordered water, and looked across the table at Eleanor Marsh and felt, for the first time since I had known her, completely unafraid. The lunch began pleasantly. She asked about work, about my father, about the project I had mentioned months ago. Then, with the first course, slipped into a sentence about property market values. Naturally, things are very fluid, which is really why I wanted to talk to you. Daniel and I have been thinking. We feel it might be the right moment to restructure how the house is held, just to simplify things, really for both of your protection. She placed a small stack of papers on the table between us. I looked at the papers. I did not touch them. Eleanor, I said. My voice was quiet, the way water is quiet right before it freezes. It's quite straightforward, she said, warm, patient. It's just a small administrative change. Daniel thought it made more sense to... Daniel knew? I said. Something moved in her face. Very fast. A recalibration. Of course, Daniel and I have discussed... Stop, I said. The word landed on the white tablecloth like a stone, and her sentence stopped mid-air. I reached into my bag and placed on the table, beside her folded document, a clear folder. Inside, the photocopy from the pendant. Behind it, the notary's documentation. Behind that, a single page on Paul Adler's letterhead, confirming that a title protection alert had been filed with the county recorder's office at 9:47 that morning. Approximately 40 minutes before Eleanor had chosen this table. Eleanor looked at the folder for a long time. The warmth in her face moved through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, rapid calculation, a last attempt at softness that collapsed before it fully formed, and landed on something I had never seen before, her real face, harder, flatter, stripped of its performance. "Where did you get that?" she said. Not a question. "A jeweler," I said. "The one who noticed the false back panel in the pendant your son gave me for our anniversary." I paused to let that sit. "You'd be amazed what a double-wall locket can carry, Eleanor. You'd be even more amazed what happens when a trained craftsman looks at it under a loupe." She said nothing. Her hands on the table were very still, the stillness of enormous conscious control. "The title alert means any attempt to file that deed will be flagged and suspended immediately," I said. "The notarized record establishes the forgery with a dated chain of evidence, and Paul Adler has already spoken to a colleague who specializes in criminal fraud. Forging a signature on a property deed is a felony. Hiding the forged document inside a piece of jewelry given as a gift, inside something worn against my skin, adds to that considerably." I folded my hands on the table. "Where is the original deed, Eleanor?" Her eyes moved, just slightly, involuntarily, to the right and down, the reflexive glance of a person whose mind has gone to the location of the thing they are protecting. "I don't know what you're—" "The deed in my filing cabinet is a forgery," I said. "A good one, but not good enough. The original is somewhere else, with you or with whoever you hired." I kept my voice perfectly even. "My solicitor has already requested a forensic handwriting comparison. This ends today, Eleanor. Either cooperate with the investigation or face the full weight of what you've set in motion alone." The silence between us was absolute. Somewhere behind me, a waiter dropped a fork, the sound ringing out sharply before the restaurant noise rose back around it. Eleanor looked at me, and I looked at Eleanor, and I believe, for the first time in 3 years, she saw me clearly. "You should go," I said quietly. "I think we're done here." Daniel was standing in the kitchen when I got home, phone in hand, in the posture of a man who has just received news that has taken the floor out from under him. He looked up, and his face held things he had not finished arranging. "My mother called," he said. "I know," I said. "Clara—" "Did you know what was in it?" I said. "The pendant. Did you know there was something hidden inside it?" He opened his mouth, closed it, put both hands flat on the counter and looked down, and the silence stretched between us like a wire pulled too tight. I watched his hands, his jaw, and I thought of all the evenings he had stepped into the garden to take calls, all the times I had let it go, and I waited. "She told me it was a custom piece," he said finally, his voice very low. "She said she'd designed it specially. She paid for it. She said the compartment was empty. She wanted you to choose what to put in it. I thought it was just a gift. I didn't know what was inside." He looked up. His eyes were wet. "I swear to you, Clara." "But you knew something," I said. "You knew she was asking about the house. You knew about the questions, the conversations. You let it happen and said nothing and sent me out into the world wearing it." My voice was entirely even. I was very proud of that. "Your silence, Daniel, was the same as participation, in a court of law and in this marriage." His face broke slightly, and the grief arrived in me then. Complicated, real, the grief of losing not one thing but an entire architecture of things you had built your life around. "Where's the original deed?" I asked. A long silence. "She has a safe. At her house. Behind the painting in the study." His voice was barely audible. "She mentioned it once." "Thank you," I said. I picked up my bag and walked to the hallway and called Paul Adler. The police executed a search warrant on Eleanor's property 2 days later and found the original deed in the safe, along with a power of attorney bearing my forged signature, a bank statement showing payment to the firm that had produced the forgeries, and, most damning, a handwritten timeline in Eleanor's own neat slanted script, dates, steps, the anticipated filing date, a plan written down, as precise and ruthless as everything else about her. Eleanor Marsh was formally charged with deed fraud, signature forgery, and criminal conspiracy. Before the bail hearing, 2 other women came forward, a former neighbor, a daughter-in-law from Eleanor's first son's brief marriage, with their own accounts of financial manipulation and property pressure. The charges multiplied. The case assembled itself with the momentum of a thing that had been waiting a long time to be seen. Daniel moved out 3 weeks later. It was not a dramatic departure. Quiet and painful and honest in the way only things that have stopped pretending can be. He stood on the front step with 2 suitcases and the coffee maker that had always been his. And we looked at each other in the November cold without finding words sufficient for what there was between us. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know," I said. "I know you are." And then he was gone, and I was standing in the doorway of my grandmother's house, alone and entirely, fundamentally, irreducibly myself. By March, the oak tree was beginning again. Small, cautious green at the tips of its branches, that tentative insistence of a thing that knows spring is possible even when the evidence is thin. I stood on the front terrace in the early morning with a mug of coffee, watching the long bars of light fall across the ironwork railing, and I breathed in the smell of cold air and damp soil and the first suggestion of warmth. And I did not try to put words to what I felt. The house was mine. The title alert remained in place redundantly because the deed fraud had been formally voided. A forged signature creates no legal title, regardless of how carefully it was prepared or how far it traveled. It was as if Eleanor's plan had never existed. All that precise, patient, ruthless work, the pendant, the timeline, the forged documents, the careful architecture of a theft, undone by a jeweler who noticed the weight distribution was wrong and looked closer. My father came on a Saturday in March and sat in the kitchen while I made lunch. He told me that my grandmother had said once, at a dinner table in this kitchen, 30 years ago, that a house is not its walls, it is the decisions made inside them. I thought about all the decisions that had been made inside these walls and all the ones I would make going forward, and I felt the truth of it like something solid under my feet. I had lost my marriage. I had lost a version of my life I had believed in. These were real losses, and I did not pretend otherwise, even in the long, quiet evenings when the only sound was the tick of the clock and the oak tree moving against the window glass. But I had not lost the house, and I had not lost myself. The owl still sat on top of the filing cabinet facing the door. I left it there, not as a monument, not as a warning, but as a reminder of the moment I had begun to look, really look, at the things I had trained myself not to see. Keep what is yours clearly in your name, Clara. I had, and when it mattered, it had been exactly enough.